All right, so we're doing question number 8. In practice, the government will have the last word on what an individual's rights are because its police will do what its officials and courts say. But that does not mean that the government's view is necessarily the correct view. Anyone who thinks it must believe that persons have only such moral rights as the government chooses to grant, which means that they have no moral rights at all. This question is asking The question is asking which of the following most accurately expresses the main conclusion of the argument. So this is a main conclusion question, and we need to identify the main conclusion in this stimulus. But let's break down the stimulus first. So what is the first sentence saying? So the government will have the last word on what an individual's rights are, so like our rights, because its police will do what its officials and courts say. So essentially the government will have the last word on what individuals' rights are. But that does not mean that the government's view is necessarily the correct view. So this is saying that this doesn't mean that what the government says, or the fact that they have the last word on individuals' rights, it doesn't mean that it's the right view. And then anyone who thinks that it is the correct view or that they are always right must believe that persons have only such moral rights as the government chooses to grant, or that we only have moral rights that the government allows us to have, which means that we actually don't have any moral rights at all. So let's try to identify the main conclusion here. If you want to pause this video and try to find it yourself, feel free, but the correct answer is, but that does not mean that the government's view is necessarily the correct view. And this is because if you break it down, so this first sentence would kind of be like background information or a fact, because it's stating that the government will have the last word, and this is why. But usually introduces some sort of a claim or a premise or a conclusion or some sort of argument. That's usually what a but introduces. And then this is more of like a anyone who thinks all this is sort of a counter, and it's sort of support for the main conclusion, which is what I've underlined. And now let's go through the answer choices and pick which one most closely resembles or most closely sounds like what we've underlined. And let's reinforce that the main conclusion is that the government's view is not necessarily the correct view. A. Individuals have no rights at all unless the government says they do. This more closely sounds like this sentence right here. And what is this? This is support for our main conclusion. So that is not our main conclusion right there. B. What government officials and courts say an individual's rights are may not be correct. I like this. This is pretty much exactly what we predicted. We made that prediction that the government's views on individual rights is not necessarily, or it doesn't mean that it's the correct view. Let's move on. C. Individuals have rights unless the government says they do not. Okay, but is that saying that they're not correct or that they're not right, or what the government says or individual rights is not necessarily correct or does not mean that it's correct? I wouldn't say so. I would say C is out. I would rule out C. D. The police always agree with government officials and the courts about what an individual's rights are. The word always is really, really strong. I would rule it out just based on too strong language. We're not looking for with top-down questions, you're not looking for an extremely strong answer. You're looking for, especially with main conclusion questions, something that sounds most like the main conclusion, but also something that's not, it's a more of a mild answer choice. So I would rule out D. E. One should always try to uphold one's individual rights against the government's view of what those rights are. One should always try to uphold. I wouldn't say that this is what our main conclusion is. Our main conclusion, like we said, is that the government's view of individual rights is not necessarily the correct view. So I would rule out E as well. And that's why B is the correct answer here.